Voice clipped by the filter mask. Female Valerian. Upper thoracic trauma. No visible movement. He already knew she was gone. His hands checked anyway, quick and practiced, 2 fingers at the throat, eyes scanning for any sign he could justify hoping for. Nothing. The nursemaid's uniform was torn dark at the chest. One arm had curled inward beneath her, like she had still been trying to shield something when she fell. Not herself. Something smaller. Ethan's gaze caught on the nursery, hatch hanging half open beyond her body. His stomach dropped. He crossed the floor fast, boots slipping once on the slick gray tiles, and shoved the inner door wider with his shoulder. The nursery was in ruin. Cradles overturned. Medical lights cracked. A transparent incubator wall starred with impact lines. The sweet antiseptic smell of a children's ward had been drowned by smoke, coolant, and the metallic reek of panic left behind too suddenly. Empty. No child. Damn it, he breathed. Static hissed across comms. Then someone from the evacuation line said, Sector 12 is collapsing. Say again. Harlo, what do you have? Ethan swallowed hard and turned once in the wreckage, forcing himself to slow down enough to actually see. Search and recovery was never just speed. Speed got people killed when your own fear started making decisions for you. He had learned that years ago in cave-ins, shuttle burns, flood rescues, anywhere the human body loved urgency more than clarity. He made himself breathe. The dead nursemaid, the open hatch, the torn blanket near the wall, a child's feeding bottle rolling in a slow circle because the floor still trembled. No signs of drag marks. No larger blood trail. Not a snatch and run. A move. Someone took the kid alive, he said into comms. Probably during first breach. Forget the kid. A voice snapped back through static. Pull out. We've got plague surge on levels 4 through 8, and the South Tower is under hard quarantine. Ethan looked at the dead nursemaid again. No. People only said forget the kid when the kid was no longer real to them. Just numbers. Protocol. Loss already filed. He hated that tone in every language. Negative, he said. There was a transfer attempt. I'm tracking. Harlo. He cut the channel. For one guilty heartbeat. He stood in the smoke and listened to the broken building breathe. Meriden was dying around him. The infected zones had gone from controlled panic to collapse in less than a day. Streets sealed. Clinics overrun. Families pulled behind quarantine lines and then lost there. He knew all of that. He also knew this. Somebody had died buying a little girl a few more minutes. That made those minutes his problem. He crouched beside the nursemaid one last time. Up close, he could see she was older than he first thought, silver trace at the temples, elegant facial markings dulled by shock and blood loss. Her eyes were half open, fixed on nothing. I'm sorry, Ethan said quietly. Something pale was twisted in her fist. He eased her fingers open. A narrow strip of ceremonial fabric, torn from a formal sash. Royal blue, threaded with metallic silver in a pattern even Ethan recognized from the colony broadcasts. Dominion crest work. Not clinic standard. Not civilian. His pulse kicked hard. No way. He looked back toward the ruined nursery. The Queen's daughter was on Meriden for a state appearance. Low profile, symbolic, tightly protected, if the news feeds were to be believed. Ethan had rolled his eyes at the broadcast 2 shifts ago while patching med tents outside the lower transit ring. Now he was kneeling in blood with royal cloth in one hand and a dead nursemaid at his feet. The world got very small all at once. A faint sound cut through the corridor. Not alarm. Not machinery. A child's cough. Ethan's head snapped toward the service wall to his right. Again. Soft. Wet. Hidden. He lunged for the panel. Fingers finding the emergency override by touch, and forced the maintenance hatch open with a shriek of warped metal. Heat and stale air gusted out. Behind the wall lay a narrow crawl conduit barely wide enough for utility drones and one desperate adult with a plan running out of time. At the far end, wrapped in a scorched thermal blanket, a small Valerian child stared back at him with huge dark eyes. Alive. For half a second, neither of them moved. She was younger than he expected, maybe 5 by human standards, delicate-boned, and trembling hard enough to shake the blanket. Ash streaked her cheeks. Her little ceremonial collar was half torn away. There was blood on the edge of the fabric, but not much of it looked like hers. In the dim emergency glow, her eyes looked too old with fear and too young to be carrying it. Ethan felt something deep in him go still. Not calm exactly. Decision. "Hey," he said, dropping to one knee at the hatch. "You're okay. I'm a medic." The lie sat there between them, obvious and necessary. She was not okay. Neither was he. Neither was the building. But there were some truths you earned in stages. The girl didn't answer. She looked past him first, searching the corridor for the person who was supposed to return. The moment she realized it wasn't that person, her mouth trembled. One hand crept up to clutch the torn blanket tighter on her throat. Ethan knew that look. He had seen it on children under rubble, in burning buses, behind floodwaters, in refugee corridors where the adults stopped coming back. It was the look that asked one question without words. "Are you staying?" His chest tightened. He reached slowly into the hatch, keeping his movements low and visible. "My name's Ethan. What's yours?" A pause. Then a whisper, papery with smoke and fear. "Naevi." The station broadcast name hit him like a blunt object. Princess Naevi Valerian. Of course. Of course the universe would do that to him now. "All right, Naevi," he said, forcing his voice steady. "I need you to do something hard for me. Can you come here?" She didn't move. Then, very softly, Seleth said, "Wait." Ethan's throat closed for a second around the dead nursemaid's name. He made himself keep breathing. Seleth was right. You waited. That was brave. He held her gaze through the hatch. "Now I'm here, and now we move." The little girl's eyes filled instantly, but she bit down on the cry like she had already learned that noise made bad things come faster. That nearly broke him more than the blood had. A deep metallic groan rolled through the nursery. The floor jolted. Dust sifted from the ceiling. Ethan glanced up. Structural failure. Close. He looked back at the child and made the choice fully. "Okay," he said gently now. "No one is leaving you here. Not today." That did it. She crawled toward him on shaking hands, small and silent except for her breathing. When she reached the edge of the conduit, she hesitated only long enough to look once over his shoulder at the empty corridor and the body beyond it. Then she came into his arms like she had run out of strength exactly at the moment she no longer had to pretend she still had some. Ethan caught her against his chest as the building groaned again, louder this time, and rose with the princess in his arms, the torn royal sash wrapped around his wrist, and the very bad feeling that if he failed in the next 10 minutes, people were going to call it kidnapping instead of rescue. The first lie Ethan told the princess was that the shaking meant they still had time. He said it while carrying her out of Nursery Wing C with one arm locked under her knees and the other bracing against the corridor wall every time the floor lurched. Red emergency light strobed across cracked tiles and hanging conduit, turning smoke into pulses of blood-dark shadow. Behind them, the ruined nursery groaned like a wounded thing trying not to collapse in front of a child. Naevi clung to the front of his rescue harness with both hands. She was trying very hard to be silent about it. Ethan could feel the effort in the tight, little tremors running through her body. Fever heat pressed through the scorched blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Every few seconds she gave a small, trapped cough in his chest plate, and each one made him walk faster. "Almost there," he said, because children deserve lies that moved in the direction of hope. The truth was uglier. The Southern Clinic block had lost pressure in 2 sectors. The plague surge was jumping containment, and half the official evacuation paths had sealed when Dominion Command decided Meriden was no longer a rescue problem, just a quarantine one. Ethan hated that logic almost as much as he hated how often it came dressed as necessity. A sharp crack split the air behind them. He didn't look back. He felt the nursery corridor go with a rolling thunder of broken supports and shattering glass. A collapse wave chasing the path they had just left. Dust punched down the hall in a gray blast. Ethan dropped his shoulder over Naevi's head and ran. The child gave one frightened gasp and buried her face against his neck. He hit the junction hard, boots skidding on debris, and nearly took the wall with him. A service cart lay overturned across the left branch, its medical trays scattered like metal bones. To the right, the route toward the main triage lifts glowed black on his visor. Sealed. Of course. He stopped just long enough to check the map pulsing on his wrist display. A maintenance spine ran beneath the transit plaza and linked to the southern decking gate. Narrow. Manual access. Probably half flooded, maybe infected, maybe blocked. Still better than standing in a dying hallway with a royal child and bad options. We're taking the ugly route, he muttered. Naevi lifted her head, just enough for one eye to appear between the folds of blanket. What is ugly route? The route medics use when engineers hate us. To his surprise, that got the smallest possible huff from her. Not a laugh. More like her fear lost its grip for 1 second. He held on to that harder than he should have. The maintenance hatch was 2 corridors down and painted in flaking yellow hazard stripes. Ethan had to shift Naevi to one hip to wrench it open, and the movement made her suck in a sharp breath. He looked down immediately. Sorry. It hurts when I move fast, she whispered. His stomach nodded. He crouched with her in his arms and scanned her the best he could one-handed. Elevated temp. Respiratory distress. Oxygen low. Small fracture indicators maybe. Hard to tell with the ambient static wrecking the reader. No major blood loss. No visible plague lesions yet. Thank God for small mercies and stupid luck. Where exactly does it hurt? She hesitated. That told him enough. Royal child or not, she had already learned one of the oldest rules in disasters. If you say where it hurts, adults might leave you behind to save someone easier. Ethan softened his voice. Naevi. Her eyes lifted to his. Kid, he said quietly. I can carry scared. I can carry stubborn. I can even carry royal if I have to. But I need honest. Something in her face changed. Not trust all at once. Permission to try. My chest, she said. And breathing. He nodded once. Okay, that helps. He adjusted the emergency filter on his own mask, snapped the secondary oxygen line loose, and clipped the child valve into the edge of her blanket hood. Not ideal. Not by a long shot. But it gave her a cleaner flow than the corridor air, and when she took the first deeper breath against it, some of the terror in her grip eased. The maintenance shaft beyond the hatch was dark, steep, and smelled like wet metal and coolant mold. Ethan descended with one hand on the ladder rungs and Naevi strapped against his front now, her small arms looped around his neck because there was nowhere else for them to go. Every step vibrated under him with distant impacts from above. Halfway down, comm static cleared just enough to leaden voices. All unauthorized movement is to be treated as breach behavior. Royal contact lost. Repeat, royal contact lost. Human rescue operative Ethan Harlo unaccounted for after clinic failure. Then a new voice, colder than the others. Any non-cleared transport involving the air is to be intercepted. If resistance occurs, lethal authorization is granted. Ethan went very still on the ladder. Naevi felt it instantly. What happened? He could have lied. He almost did. Then he looked at the little hand twisted in the front of his harness and decided fear was already doing enough work in this world without him feeding it stupidly. They think I took you. The words sat there in the shaft, ugly and true. Naevi's breath hitched. Did they say kidnapped? He closed his eyes for one beat. Yeah. She was quiet for so long he thought maybe the line had broken her. Then, very small, Seleth said people get foolish when crowns are scared. That nearly stopped him. He resumed climbing down because the alternative was thinking too hard about a dead nursemaid who had still found time to explain politics to a child while the world ended. At the bottom of the shaft, the maintenance spine stretched ahead in low blue darkness, just tall enough for Ethan to move in a crouch. Pipes lined both walls. Condensation dripped steadily from overhead joints. The station map on his wrist flickered, struggled, then stabilized enough to draw a trembling line toward the decking gate. 800 meters. On fresh legs, that was nothing. On Meriden, with a sick child, no backup, and half the Dominion thinking you were a murderer, it looked like another planet. Naevi stirred against him. Will they shoot you? The question was so direct it hurt. Ethan kept moving. They'll think about it. That is not a no. No, he admitted. It's not. Another silence. Then she said, in a voice trying very hard to sound brave and failing because she was 5 and exhausted. "If they shoot you, who carries me?" Ethan's throat tightened so hard he could barely answer. "No one's shooting me today." "How do you know?" He ducked beneath a hanging cable bundle and forced some rough humor into his tone. "Because I'm having a terrible enough day already." This time she did laugh. Tiny, cracked at the edges. Real anyway. The sound nearly undid him. He pressed on through the maintenance spine while Meriden shook above them. Once they passed a side conduit, where 2 bodies in quarantine suits lay slumped against the wall, hands almost touching, and Ethan turned Naevi's face into his shoulder before she could see. Once he had to wade through knee-deep runoff carrying gray ash and something chemical that made his skin crawl even through the suit. Once the lights died entirely and he walked by visor glow alone, listening to the child breathe and counting every inhale like it was a task he could finish if he tried hard enough. By the time they reached the southern Deccan gate, his legs were shaking. The armored blast door stood half-sealed under a curtain of sparks. Emergency shutters jammed. Manual wheel lock intact. Beside it, slumped against the control column, was a Dominion security officer with half his visor blown out and no pulse left to find. Ethan stared at the dead guard, then at the sealed gate, then down at the child in his arms. Naevi looked back up at him through fever-bright eyes. "Medkel." It took him half a second to realize she meant medic. "Yeah, kid." Her fingers tightened weakly at his chest. "Please don't stop." He looked at the blood on the dead guard, the locked door, the impossible wheel mechanism that would take both hands and more strength than he still trusted himself to have. And he looked back at her. "I won't," he said. And for the first time since leaving the nursery, Ethan understood exactly how this story was going to look from the outside. A dead nursemaid, a missing princess, a human found running with her through quarantine. If he failed here, no one was going to hear the truth before the accusation won. The dead guard's rifle was still warm. Ethan saw that before he saw the blood pattern, and that told him everything he needed to know. The man had not died holding the line. He had died trying to keep the southern Deccan gate open while the world behind him collapsed faster than orders could keep up. The rifle lay half under one arm, fingers still hooked near the trigger guard. The blast door beside him was sealed to a narrow black seam. Emergency wheel locked hard. Naevi felt Ethan stop and lifted her head from his shoulder. The little princess looked at the body for 1 second too long. He turned her gently into his chest before the image could settle deeper. "Don't." He was trying, she whispered. Ethan closed his eyes for half a beat. "Yeah." The maintenance corridor hummed around them, all pipe rattle and distant structural groans, like Meriden itself was breathing through broken ribs. Sparks drizzled from a cracked panel above the blast door in bright, angry spits. The air tasted metallic now, hotter than before. Not fire exactly. System strain. Pressure building somewhere ugly. Ethan shifted Naevi higher in his arms and crossed to the control column. Manual override. Mechanical wheel lock. Dead access panel. No power. Of course, there was no power. Worlds never failed one useful thing at a time. He crouched beside the fallen officer just long enough to search the belt rig with a muttered apology. A sealant strip. 2 ration gels. 1 cracked station key. No bypass core. Nothing easy. Nothing that would save his shoulders from what came next. Naevi watched him from the floor, where he had set her against the wall in the least filthy patch of corridor he could find. He had wrapped the blanket around her again and clipped the oxygen line a little tighter under her chin. She looked impossibly small there, royal sash half visible beneath the scorched folds, dark eyes too alert for a fevered child. Kids in disasters either crashed or sharpened. She had sharpened. "Are we stuck?" she asked. Ethan put both hands on the wheel. Cold metal bit through his gloves. "Not unless the universe is feeling especially dramatic." Naevi thought about that. It does seem dramatic. He barked one rough laugh despite himself. "Yeah. Fair." Then he pulled. Nothing. The wheel didn't move so much as insult him. Ethan reset his footing, pain already singing through his back and forearms. He had been awake for 21 hours. He had run through a collapsing clinic, carried a sick child through a maintenance spine, and ignored every sane instruction his comm had tried to give him. His legs were shaking for reasons no amount of pride could reframe. But the gate had to open, and there was no one else coming. He pulled again, harder. The wheel jerked a quarter inch and stopped with a scream of metal. Naevi flinched at the sound. Is it breaking? It better be, he grunted. A crackle burst through the dead guard's shoulder comm. Static. Then voices. Southern Gate Team, status report. Ethan froze. The transmission hissed again. Repeat, status report. Thermal scans show movement in the lower maintenance corridor. Possible hostile transport. Naevi's fingers tightened in the blanket. Ethan stared at the comm unit like it had personally offended him. Of course the scans were still live. Of course Command had enough working equipment to hunt survivors and not enough to open evacuation routes. He snatched the unit from the guard's harness and thumbed the transmit. This is Ethan Harlo, search and recovery medic, he said. I am at Southern Deccan with the air alive and in respiratory distress. Open this gate now. Silence. Then a different voice, controlled and cold. You are under accusation for the murder of Royal Nursemaid Selith and the abduction of Princess Naevi Valerian. You are ordered to stand down and await secured retrieval. Ethan actually laughed. It came out cracked and ugly and halfway to furious. Secured retrieval, he said. She needs treatment, not theater. You will surrender the child. No. Naevi looked at him sharply. The calm voice hardened. Human, your refusal confirms hostile intent. Ethan stared at the sealed gate, at the dead officer, at the child trying not to cough because she had already learned coughing scared adults. Something hot and reckless rose in him then. Not the kind that made men stupid, but the kind that made them impossible to move once they decided where right was. She's alive because I refused easier options all day, he said. So, you can write whatever report helps you sleep later. I'm opening this door. He killed the comm and tossed it aside. For 1 second the corridor was quiet except for Naevi's breathing and the soft spit of sparks above them. Then the little girl said, very carefully, you sound angry. Ethan looked at her. He could have softened it. Should have, maybe. But she had earned honesty 3 disasters ago. I am. At me? God. He crossed back to her immediately, dropping to one knee despite how his legs objected. No, absolutely not at you. Naevi studied his face the way frightened children did when they were checking if the answer was real. Then at who? The people making this harder than it has to be. She nodded once, as if that fit the world she already suspected adults lived in. Then, after a pause, Selith got that look too. Right before she hid me. The dead nursemaid's name hit him like a weight dropped into water. What did she tell you? Naevi looked down at the blanket. She said if the wrong people found me first, I must wait for someone kind, not someone important. Ethan stopped breathing for 1 brutal second. Across a dying world, through quarantine collapse and smoke and bodies and stupid command channels, that woman had hidden the queen's daughter inside a maintenance wall and bet everything on kindness arriving before politics did. He felt suddenly, horribly unworthy of how much trust strangers kept putting in his hands. Naevi's voice came smaller now. Are you kind? He looked at her fever-bright eyes, the ash on her cheek, the little stubborn chin she was trying to keep from shaking. I'm trying very hard to be. That seemed to satisfy her more than any grand promise would have. She nodded once and leaned her head back against the wall. Then opened the door, Ethan. No medic this time. Just Ethan. That did something sharp to his chest. He stood and went back to the wheel. This time he braced one boot against the column housing, set both hands high, and pulled with everything he had left. Tendons burned. His vision blurred at the edges. The wheel fought him like a living thing, rust and lock pressure and bad engineering all welded together by bad luck. Come on, he hissed. Metal shrieked. The wheel turned. 1/4, then half. Then another dragging notch while the blast door seam shuddered and widened just enough to leak a knife-thin line of white quarantine light through the dark. Ethan nearly sagged with it. Then the whole corridor boomed. Not from the gate. From behind. A detonation rolled through the maintenance spine they had come from, close enough to punch dust and hot air over them in a violent wave. Lights blew out in 2 sections. Naevi cried out. Ethan spun on instinct, body between her and the tunnel. as debris rattled off the walls and the passage behind them vanished into smoke. For one terrified heartbeat, he thought the blast had sealed their exit completely. Then shapes moved in the haze. Boots, armor, shock lights cutting through gray. A retrieval squad. Too fast, too soon, and from somewhere inside the smoke, amplified through a helmet speaker, came the order Ethan had been dreading since the nursery. Target acquired, a voice said. Take the human alive, if possible. The first trooper out of the smoke had his rifle pointed at Ethan's chest and his fear pointed everywhere else. Ethan saw it instantly. Not just the weapon, not just the armor markings of Dominion internal security, but the tiny instability in the man's stance. Too fast on the trigger, too stiff in the shoulders. The kind of fear that made people mistake obedience for certainty. 3 more figures emerged behind him through the haze of the blasted maintenance spine. Shock lamps cutting white bars across the corridor. Their boots hit the deck in disciplined rhythm. Their formation was good. Their timing was terrible. Naevi was still on the floor behind Ethan, coughing into the blanket now, the sound sharper than before. He could hear fluid in it. Not much. Enough to matter. The half-open decking gate beside him glowed with a narrow seam of sterile light and false salvation. One more turn on the wheel, and he might be able to get her through. One more second, and the squad would have him on the ground. Step away from the child, the lead trooper ordered. Ethan didn't move. The corridor smelled like hot dust, metal, and the sour edge of fresh explosives. Smoke crawled around the trooper's boots and over the dead guard by the control column, making the whole scene feel unreal, staged by someone with no idea how rescue actually looked. Ethan raised his hands slowly to shoulder height, palms open, but he kept his body between the rifles and the little girl. She needs immediate care, he said. You can cuff me after she's through that gate. The lead trooper's helmet turned just enough to register the dead guard, the cracked panel, the forced will lock, the child wrapped in thermal cloth. Ethan saw the calculation happen and then get strangled by orders. You are under seizure for the murder of nursemaid Selith and unlawful transport of the air. Then your intelligence is broken. A second trooper shifted his weapon. Watch your tone. Ethan laughed once, tired and sharp. You came into a collapse zone with rifles aimed at a medic carrying a sick kid. I'm not the one with a tone problem. Behind him, Naevi gave a small, choking cough. He didn't turn, but every muscle in his body reacted to it anyway. The lead trooper noticed. Princess Naevi, he said, voice changing at once, becoming careful in the artificial way armed people sounded when they remembered title. We are here to recover you. Naevi was quiet for one beat too long. Then, from behind Ethan's legs, thin and hoarse but clear enough to cut the corridor open, she said no. Every helmet in the hall shifted. Ethan's pulse slammed harder. The lead trooper crouched slightly, trying to see past him. Your Highness, the human is suspected in the attack on your nursemaid. You are not safe with him. Naevi grabbed the back of Ethan's suit with both hands. He's why I am alive. It was the first time she had said it to anyone but him. The words landed like a dropped blade. The troopers hesitated. Not much. Enough. The lead tried again. Your Highness, trauma can distort. No, stronger now, despite the rasp in her lungs. Selith hid me. Ethan found me. He carried me. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. Not relief. Not yet. But something in him loosened anyway. The child was exhausted, sick, terrified, and still choosing truth while armed adults dressed their fear up as procedure. He had seen courage in grown men with medals. This felt rarer. A crackle erupted from the lead trooper's shoulder comm, someone higher up, listening in. Status, a clipped voice demanded. The lead trooper hesitated. That hesitation told Ethan everything. The squad had expected a snatch operation. Simple extraction. Human blamed, heir secured, paperwork later. They had not expected the heir to speak. They had definitely not expected her to contradict the story they'd been given while still crouched behind the alleged kidnapper, like he was the safest object left on the planet. The calm voice sharpened. Report. The trooper swallowed hard enough for Ethan to see it move under the throat seals. Heir verbal. Claims human carried her from the clinic. Silence answered. Then a new voice came over the channel. Female. Older. Controlled down to the molecular level. Patch visual now. The entire squad stiffened. Even Ethan felt the change, and he had no idea who was on the line until the trooper's visor display flickered outward in pale blue reflection against the corridor wall. A face resolved there in compressed light. Narrow features, silver-black coronet lines at the brow, eyes so steady they made panic feel childish. Queen Alice Valerian. Naevi made a sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a breath. Mother. Everything in the corridor changed shape around that one word. The troopers dropped to one knee, so fast their armor clattered. Ethan stayed standing because he had a child half hidden behind him and no spare hands for monarchy. The Queen's projected gaze moved over the scene in one sweep. The dead guard, the damaged gate, the smoke, the human medic covered in dust and blood, the little girl clutching his suit. When her eyes settled on Ethan, he felt the full weight of a government trying to decide whether he was a savior or the spark that would set its war fleets moving. Naevi, the Queen said first, and the composure in her voice cracked at the edges just enough to prove it cost her something. Come forward, little star. Naevi didn't. Ethan felt her fingers tighten instead. Your Highness, the lead trooper whispered urgently, as if the child had violated protocol by preferring survival over optics. The Queen noticed. Ethan saw that too. Naevi, she repeated softer now. Why are you still behind the human? The child lifted her head against Ethan's back. Her voice came out rough with fever and smoke and the terrible honesty children used when adults had failed enough times to lose their decorative answers. Because everyone else came with guns. No one in the corridor moved. Ethan stared at the cracked floor, because if he looked at the Queen then, whatever showed on his face might get him shot out of sheer political inconvenience. The Queen was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, it was not to her daughter. Medic Ethan Harlo, she said. He turned his head enough to face the projection. Yes, ma'am. Did you kill Selith? No. Did you take my daughter from her assigned protection? No. The Queen's eyes did not blink. Then why are you running with her through a plague breach while my soldiers point rifles at your heart? Ethan let out one breath. This was it. The whole impossible, ugly truth, balanced on a corridor full of smoke and armed nerves and one half-open gate that still wasn't enough. Because your nursemaid died buying time, he said. Because your daughter was hidden in a maintenance wall and left with instructions to wait. Because your command net locked routes faster than rescue teams could move. Because every person with authority kept telling me to surrender a child they were more prepared to secure than save. He heard the lead trooper inhale sharply. Didn't care. Naevi's fingers stayed locked in his suit. Ethan went on, quieter now, because rage had never been the point. I'm not running from you. I'm running from delay. She needs treatment, and I'm out of places to carry her. The Queen looked at him for one long, unreadable second. Then she said to the squad, lower your weapons. No one breathed. The rifles came down. The corridor felt suddenly huge. The Queen's gaze shifted to the decking gate, then back to Ethan. Open it, she said. He almost laughed from sheer exhaustion. Working on it. One corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, not quite anything safe. Then let no one here delay you again. As the troopers surged to the wheel at last, and Naevi's grip on his suit finally loosened, Ethan understood the truth with a clarity that felt almost cruel. This was never going to stay a rescue story. By morning, half the Dominion would call him a kidnapper cleared by royal mercy. The other half would call him the human who shamed a quarantine line into humanity. Fleets might still move. Ministers would still lie. Somebody, somewhere, would still want Selith's death to mean war. But now the Queen had heard her daughter choose him over armed recovery. And there were some accusations too late to survive that. The deck and chamber doors sealed behind Ethan with a sound like the world, making one last decision for him. Sterile white light flooded the room. Air jets hit first, roaring down from the ceiling vents hard enough to rattle his teeth and tug at the blanket wrapped around Naevi. The chamber smelled of antiseptic, ozone, and heated metal. Beyond the transparent inner barrier, medtechs and royal security moved in overlapping shadows, their voices muted by thick glass and protocol distance. Naevi flinched at the blast of air and pressed herself tighter against Ethan's chest. "It's all right," he said, though his own pulse was still hammering from the corridor. "Just Deccan." She looked up at him through fever-bright eyes. That sounds like something adults say before unpleasant things. Despite everything, a cracked laugh escaped him. "Yeah, that's fair." The floor strip beneath his boots flashed amber, then green. Contamination scan. Thermal red. Identity lock. Ethan kept one hand at the back of Naevi's head so the air jets wouldn't whip her face sideways. The little girl had gone frighteningly limp now that they had stopped moving. Adrenaline had carried her farther than her body wanted to go, and the moment safety became possible, she was starting to fold. That scared him more than the guns had. A medic on the far side of the glass stepped forward and held up a hand signal, placed the child on the intake platform. Ethan didn't move. Not right away. The platform stood in the center of the chamber under a halo of white surgical light. Too clean, too cold, too much like the kind of place where children got separated from the only familiar thing left in sight. He felt Naevi's fingers still hooked in the front straps of his rescue harness. She was watching the shapes beyond the glass with the fixed, animal stillness of someone deciding whether to panic and simply too tired to manage it. A speaker crackled overhead. "Medic Harlo," said a calm female voice from the control booth, "place the princess on the intake bed. She requires immediate intervention." Ethan wet his lips. "Then open the inner door and let me carry her through." "That is not procedure." The answer came too fast, too polished. He stared through the glass at the waiting team. Dominion Royal medics in pale, bio-sealed robes. 2 armed guards behind them. 1 council physician with a face Ethan recognized from earlier emergency briefings and already disliked. All prepared. All professional. All one step too far away from the child they intended to save. Naevi's grip tightened weakly. "Ethan," she whispered. He looked down instantly. "Yeah, kid. Will you still be here when I wake up?" There it was. Not fear of needles. Not fear of queens, or plague, or politics. Just the one question every abandoned child eventually asked. His throat tightened hard enough to hurt. "Yes," he said. The overhead voice returned. "Medic, we do not have time for emotional delay." Ethan lifted his head, and something in his face must have changed because 2 of the medtechs behind the glass went still. "With respect," he said, very quietly, "you had time for armed retrieval and accusation. You have time for 30 more seconds." No one answered. He bent and eased Naevi down onto the intake platform as gently as he knew how. The second his hand started to leave her, she panicked. Not loudly. Somehow that made it worse. Her breathing went rapid and shallow, one hand flying out to catch his sleeve with the desperate reflex of someone falling inside her own body. Ethan leaned in immediately, one hand still against her shoulder. Hey, I'm here." Her eyes found him and locked there. "You said." "I know what I said." He lowered himself beside the platform until they were almost level. "Listen to me. They need to help you breathe better. That means I let go for a minute. It does not mean I'm gone." The little girl searched his face like she was checking every word for cracks. Beyond the glass, someone was arguing with someone else. He couldn't hear it, but he could read the body language easily enough. Delay. Procedure. Clearance. Royal access. Human contamination risk. Ethan wanted to put his fist through the barrier and introduce all of them to urgency personally. Instead, he kept his eyes on Naevi. "Can you do one hard thing for me?" She swallowed and nodded once. "Let go of my sleeve." For a terrible second, he thought she wouldn't. Then, with all the trembling dignity of a child trying not to break in public, she opened her fingers. The inner barrier slid aside. Medical staff flooded in at once with practice speed, scanners lighting blue across Naevi's chest and throat. Oxygen hood. For line. Thermal blanket replacement. One nurse moved to guide Ethan back, but the princess made a broken protesting sound the instant he shifted away. "No!" The whole team paused. A new voice came from the doorway behind the medical line. "Then don't move him." Queen Alice Valerian entered the Deccan suite without ceremony, flanked by 2 guards who understood from her expression that they were ornamental at best. In person, she looked taller than the projection had suggested, not because of height, but because grief and command had sharpened her into something almost architectural. Her formal black and silver garments had been thrown over emergency underlayers too quickly to hide the fact that she had dressed while afraid. Her eyes went first to Naevi. The queen crossed the room in 3 quick steps and stopped at the platform, every movement held together by force. Ethan saw the exact second she took into 4 line, the fever flush, the ash in her daughter's hair, the marks where the blanket had rubbed at her throat. Naevi looked at her and whispered, "Mother." The queen's face broke. Not publicly, not much, just enough to tell the truth. She knelt beside the platform opposite Ethan, one hand hovering above the child for a heartbeat, as if afraid touching her would prove this was still a dream that could be taken away. Then she rested her palm lightly against Naevi's hair. "My little star," she said. Naevi's mouth trembled. "Seleth is dead." The words hit the room like a pressure drop. No one moved. Queen Alice closed her eyes for 1 second, and when she opened them again, the grief was still there, but now it had been forced into shape. "I know. I waited. I know. She told me to wait for someone kind." The queen's gaze shifted, slowly, toward Ethan. He had been in front of commanding officers before. Disaster panels, recovery tribunals, military review boards after missions that had gone sideways and stayed there. None of them had ever looked at him like this. Not with gratitude, not with suspicion, not with both at once and too much at stake for either to be simple. "You carried her alone?" the queen asked. Ethan stood because kneeling suddenly felt too intimate for what this was becoming. Every muscle in his body protested. From nursery wing C through the maintenance spine to southern Deccan. "You disobeyed quarantine commands." "Yes." "You overrode armed retrieval." "Yes." Her expression did not change. "You spoke to my soldiers as if they were fools." That one made him pause. In my defense, they were behaving ambitiously. One of the medtechs made a strangled sound that might have been a laugh and immediately looked horrified by their own survival instinct. Even the queen's mouth shifted by a fraction before settling again. Then Naevi, half under oxygen now and already drifting toward exhaustion, reached one weak hand toward Ethan without taking her eyes off her mother. "He stayed," she mumbled. The queen looked at that small outstretched hand, then at Ethan, then back to her daughter. Something changed, not softened, aligned. "Then he stays," she said. A council physician near the rear stepped forward at once. "Your Majesty, that is not advisable. We still do not have full forensic sequencing on nursemaid Seleth's death, and the human remains central to my daughter being alive," the queen said, without raising her voice. The room went dead still. The physician swallowed and stepped back. Naevi's fingers found Ethan's wrist. "Small. Huh. Real." He looked down at her and felt the last of the adrenaline draining out of him, leaving only exhaustion and the dangerous hollow that came after surviving something before your body had agreed to it. He should have felt relief. Instead, he looked at the queen, at the physicians, at the guards, at the sealed white room where accusation had turned into witness but not yet into safety, and understood exactly where the next danger lived. Meriden was only the beginning, because saving the queen's daughter had kept one child alive. Proving who wanted her dead was going to decide whether worlds burned for it. Queen Alice did not leave the Deccan suite until Naevi's breathing steadied. Ethan noticed because everyone else kept glancing at the queen and adjusting themselves around her presence, while she stayed exactly where she was beside the intake bed, one hand resting lightly over her daughter's blanket, as if pressure alone could keep the child anchored to the living. The sterile room hummed with filters and monitor tones. White light reflected off the glass partitions so sharply it made everyone look more tired, more brittle, less able to hide what fear had already cost them. Naevi slept at last under the oxygen hood. Not peacefully. Her small face still tightened now and then, as if some part of her was running through smoke, even unconscious. Ethan stood 3 paces back with a med-wrapped strip pressed against a cut on his forearm he did not remember getting. The adrenaline was gone. In its place had come the full-body reckoning. Shaking legs, dry mouth, back screaming from the carry, lungs raw from ash. He had survived the part where movement mattered. That was usually when politics began. He hated being right. A side door opened with a hush of seals. 3 new figures entered the suite's outer chamber. A narrow-faced royal advisor in black formal layers, a military commander with dark gray armor still dusted from transit, and a forensic minister carrying a data slate like it had already decided who was guilty. They stopped at the internal glass until the Queen acknowledged them with a look. "Your Majesty," the advisor said, keeping his voice low. "The Emergency Council requests immediate statement before the War Chamber convenes." War Chamber. The phrase hit Ethan like cold water. The commander's gaze slid to him and stayed there. Not openly hostile. Worse. Measuring. Calculating how much trouble a human medic could be if he turned out innocent at the wrong political moment. Queen Alice rose slowly from Naevi's bedside. Her control had returned, but Ethan could see where it was being held together. Around the eyes. In the mouth. In the tiny delay before each breath. "You have my statement," she said. "My daughter is alive." The forensic minister stepped closer to the glass. "And nursemaid Seleth is dead. Dominion Fleet Command has already received requests for retaliatory posture from 3 noble houses." Ethan looked up sharply. Retaliatory posture. So that was the speed of it. A dead royal attendant, a vanished heir, a quarantined world, and suddenly people very far from smoke and blood wanted ships moving. The commander folded his hands behind his back. "Rumor is outrunning containment, Your Majesty. If the child was targeted, and if foreign involvement can be suggested." Suggested? The Queen's voice cut through him like a wire. "Is it your threshold now?" The room went still. Ethan watched the advisor exchange one fast look with the forensic minister. There it was. Not grief. Opportunity. Not necessarily for war, maybe, but for leverage. Positioning. Pressure. Seleth wasn't even cold in the ground, and already powerful people were trying to decide what her death could purchase. The Queen turned to Ethan then. "Medic Harlo, tell them." Every eye in the suite shifted to him. He felt suddenly, painfully human in the middle of all that power. Too dusty, too tired, too angry. A rescue worker in a stained suit standing under royal lights with no rank high enough to make this comfortable. But Naevi was alive behind him. Seleth was dead because she had bought minutes with her body. If he let prettier people tell the story now, they would ruin it. Ethan straightened despite the protest from his spine. Nursery Wing C had signs of forced breach and rapid evacuation. Nursemaid Seleth hid the princess inside a maintenance conduit. She was dead by the time I entered. He kept his voice even, because rage would only make them hear species before facts. I found no indication that Seleth was killed by the child or by random collapse. The wound was targeted. Close range. Deliberate. The forensic minister's eyes sharpened. "You're making that assessment as a field medic?" "I'm making it as someone who knows the difference between structural trauma and a strike meant to stop a person before they finish protecting someone smaller." The commander's jaw shifted. "And yet you chose not to report in once you had secured the air." Ethan looked straight at him. "I did report. Your people answered with seizure orders." A beat of silence. The advisor stepped in quickly, smooth as oil. "Given the confusion, surely you can appreciate that armed recovery was unavoidable." "No," Ethan said. The word landed harder because he didn't raise his voice. The advisor blinked. No, I can't appreciate it. Not after walking a sick child across a dying colony, while command channels worried harder about custody than treatment." The commander took one step forward. Careful, human. Ethan felt the old instinct to yield, to rank rise and die in the same second. He was too tired to be diplomatic at the cost of honesty. "I was careful," he said, "for 6 straight hours. That stopped the room colder than anger would have." The Queen watched him without interrupting. Ethan went on, quieter now. Seleth trusted that if the wrong people found Naevi first, they would see risk before they saw child. She was right enough to die planning around it. The forensic minister looked away first. Good, Ethan thought. Let that sting. A soft sound came from behind him. Naevi, not awake exactly. Shifting. Her hand moved weakly against the blanket. Searching. Ethan turned on instinct, and the queen did too. The little princess's eyes fluttered half open beneath the hood haze. She looked confused for one frightening second, then found her mother, then Ethan, and some of the tension left her tiny body. "Still here?" she whispered. Ethan stepped closer to the bedside before any official could object. "Yeah, kid. Still here." Her gaze slid toward the figures beyond the glass. Even exhausted, she understood a room full of adults deciding things around her. "They're loud," she murmured. To Ethan's surprise, the queen almost smiled. "Yes," she said. "They often are." Naevi's eyes drifted shut again. But before sleep reclaimed her fully, she turned her face weakly toward the chamber side and said, with all the careless accuracy only a child could manage, "The bad one smelled like cold flowers." The room stopped breathing. Ethan felt every nerve in his body wake back up. The queen went still beside the bed. "Naevi," she said very gently, "what bad one?" The child's lashes trembled. In the nursery hall, before Seleth ran. Her voice was fading already. "Cold flowers. Metal gloves." He bowed when no one was looking. The forensic minister's slate slipped in his hand. The advisor's face changed first. Not guilt, recognition. And Ethan saw it. Saw the tiny break in composure, the involuntary flick of the eyes toward the commander, and understood with a rush of nausea that the war they'd been preparing to launch outward might have started much closer to the throne. Queen Alice saw it too. When she turned toward her council, the air in the Deccan suite changed. Grief remained. So did fear. But now both had somewhere to point. "Seal the palace channels," she said. "No fleet movements. No retaliation orders. No one leaves the capital without my voice print." The commander stiffened. "Your Majesty." "That," the queen said, and her voice dropped into something so cold Ethan almost pitted the room, "was not a request." Naevi slept again. Ethan stood beside her under the white lights. Exhaustion and fury and impossible relief all tangled together, and realized the child had done it again. Not with rank, not with force, just by remembering one honest detail adults had overlooked while they rushed toward war. The war chamber doors sealed with a sound Ethan felt in his teeth. He stood just inside the threshold under a vault of dark metal and suspended light, his borrowed formal coat still smelling faintly of Deccan chemicals and smoke. The chamber of the Valeran Dominion was built to intimidate before a single word was spoken. Tiered seats curved around a lowered central floor of black stone shot through with silver veins. Tactical star maps hovered above the council wells in cold blue layers. At the far end, beneath the Dominion crest, Queen Alice stood at the primary dais with her daughter's survival and half her government's shame hanging in the room like a blade. Ethan had no business being there. That was obvious from the way the nobles looked at him. Some with suspicion, some with open distaste. A few with the more dangerous expression powerful people wore when a witness had survived too long and too publicly. He felt every stare against the back of his neck and kept walking anyway, guided by a palace aide whose hands were shaking hard enough to rattle the data slate she carried. "Stand here," she whispered, placing him at the lower witness ring. "Comforting," Ethan muttered. She almost smiled. Almost. Then she stepped away like proximity to him had become politically charged. Across the chamber, Commander Rivik stood in full military gray beneath the tactical displays, rigid as a drawn blade. To the Queen's right waited Forensic Minister Taurin with 3 sealed case slates. To her left stood Advisor Sarit, black formal robes neat as ink, face composed into the careful blankness of someone trying very hard not to look guilty of recognizing something important at the wrong moment. Ethan remembered that flick of Sarit's eyes in the Deccan suite. Cold flowers, metal gloves, a bow when no one was looking, a child's detail, a killer's mistake. The chamber was already in motion when he arrived. Voices low, urgent, layered. Fleet posture, internal lockdown, chain of command, evidence admissibility. Every phrase told Ethan the same thing. Grown people had come within inches of launching a war because they were faster at mobilizing power than listening to a child. The Queen lifted one hand. Silence fell immediately. 3 hours ago, Alice said, her voice carrying clean and cold across the chamber. This council prepared to authorize retaliatory deployment based on the presumed murder of my daughter and the death of nursemaid Selith. Her gaze moved once around the room. My daughter is alive. Nursemaid Selith was murdered while protecting her. Those are facts. Everything beyond them is now under scrutiny. A noble from the upper tier rose before permission was granted. Your Majesty, with respect, delay now signals weakness. The colony was breached during quarantine collapse. Your heir disappeared. Dominion houses are already demanding. The queen turned her head. That was all. The noble sat down like someone had quietly removed his bones. Ethan did not know Valerian court politics. He did no command presence when he saw it. Alice was holding the chamber together by force of control and one fraying thread of maternal rage, and nobody in the room was too stupid not to feel it. Tauren stepped forward. Preliminary reconstruction confirms nursemaid Selith died from a directed close-range chest strike inconsistent with structural collapse. His voice was precise, almost brittle. The nursery breach also shows signs of internal access rather than outside assault. A ripple moved through the chamber. Internal. That word mattered. Commander Revik frowned. You are suggesting palace-linked interference on Meriden during plague lockdown? Tauren looked like he hated the answer before he gave it. I am suggesting the available evidence does not support an external kidnapping narrative. The chamber grew sharper after that. Not louder. More dangerous. Nobles stopped arguing in broad emotional strokes and started calculating. Ethan could practically hear loyalties reshuffling behind their eyes. If the attack had come from inside the Dominion, then every house demanding war now had to consider how guilty they might look for wanting it so quickly. Queen Alice let the silence stretch before speaking again. Princess Naevi identified a sensory detail from the nursery corridor before Selith moved her. A few in the chamber visibly disliked the phrase sensory detail. Ethan understood why. Children made messy witnesses. Hard to script. Harder to discredit without looking monstrous. The queen continued. A scent. Cold flowers, and metal gloves accompanied by formal bow protocol. That did it. For the first time since entering, Ethan saw genuine fear move through the room. Not panic. Recognition. An older minister in white gold advisory bands spoke from the lower tier. Cold flower oil is restricted to ceremonial use among inner courthouses. Another answered too quickly. Many use it. Not with metal gloves, said a third. No one of rank wears conductive ceremonial metal during nursery visits, Tauren added, unless they were not expecting to enter one. I shifted. Small movements. Tiny betrayals. Ethan watched them all and hated how familiar it felt. Different species, same disease. People with power never lied, cleanly under pressure. They leaked priorities first. Queen Alice looked down toward Ethan. Medic Harlo. He straightened. You were with my daughter when she woke in Deccan. Tell this chamber what you observed from the moment you entered Nursery Wing C. Every face turned toward him again. He could have dressed it up, made it cleaner, more diplomatic. Instead, he gave him the thing he trusted most, sequence. I entered Nursery Wing C after clinic collapse began in the southern block, he said. Found nursemaid Selith dead in the corridor near the nursery hatch. Wound looked targeted. Close. Protective posture suggested she was buying time. He kept his voice level, forcing the room to come to him instead of the other way around. Inside the nursery, I found signs of rapid movement, one hidden maintenance conduit, and the princess alive inside it. She stated Selith told her to wait. I extracted her through the maintenance spine because main routes were sealed or under hostile retrieval order. Commander Revik's jaw tightened. Hostile according to whom? According to the rifles pointed at my chest, Ethan said. A few heads turned toward the commander. Good. Ethan went on. I reported the princess alive at Southern Deccan. Command response was seizure and surrender language before medical priority. That choice would have killed time she didn't have. One noble rose halfway. You accuse Dominion Command of endangering the air? Ethan met his eyes. I accuse people in clean rooms of falling in love with procedure while a child was running out of air. That hit harder than it should have. Maybe because everyone in the room knew exactly how plausible it was. A sharp chime cut through the chamber. One of the side doors opened. The palace aide from before entered at speed, pale and breathless, carrying a live relay slate in both hands. "Your Majesty," she said, not even trying to hide urgency, "Princess Naevi is awake. She is asking for the human." The whole chamber reacted, some with irritation, some with disbelief. Queen Alice was something much more private. Ethan felt his chest tighten unexpectedly, not because he feared for Naevi, because he knew what it meant for a child to ask for the person who carried them out. It meant the fear had not ended just because the room got cleaner. The queen looked at him for one unreadable second, then to the chamber. "This session will hold." Commander Revik stepped forward. "Your Majesty, with respect, we are in the middle of an internal security crisis." Alice did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "And I am in the middle of deciding which of you nearly turned my daughter's survival into a war." She extended one hand toward Ethan. "The medic comes with me." No one challenged that. Not because they agreed. Because the queen had stopped sounding like a ruler managing disorder. She sounded like a mother who had just found out the attack came from inside her own walls. As Ethan followed her out beneath the vaulted crest of the Dominion, he looked back once at the chamber full of nobles and ministers now trapped with each other in their own shifting fear. For the first time since Meriden, he was not the most politically dangerous thing in the room. And that, more than the guns or the accusations, told him the real story had finally begun. Naevi was gone from her bed. Ethan saw it before the palace medic reached him, before the alarm tones shifted, before the corridor outside the royal recovery suite erupted into controlled panic. 1 second he was stepping through the open inner doors behind Queen Alice, still carrying the cold weight of the war chamber in his chest. The next he was staring at an empty recovery platform, tangled blankets, and an oxygen hood swaying gently, as if the child had only just slipped free of it. Every part of him went hard and cold at once. The recovery suite sat in the East Palace Medical Wing, all white glass, silver support beams, and polished floor, so clean it reflected the emergency lights now starting to pulse along the walls. The room smelled of antiseptic and warm circuitry. 2 medtechs stood frozen near the far console, guilty shock written all over them. One security guard was already barking into a wristcom, another had his shock baton drawn like that would somehow help find a sick 5-year-old in a royal hospital. Queen Alice did not scream. That frightened Ethan more than if she had. "Explain," she said. The nearest medic tried. "Your Majesty, the princess was conscious, agitated, asking repeatedly for the human medic. We adjusted the sedative line to prevent respiratory strain, but there was a 6-second sensor blackout during chamber recalibration, and my daughter vanished." The medic looked like he wanted the floor to open. Ethan was already moving. He crossed the bed, dropped to one knee, and ignored everyone around him for one clean, brutal second. Panic was loud. Search and recovery had taught him to become quieter than it. The blanket on the bed was half dragged. One sock on the floor. Oxygen line detached by small hands, not torn. The side rail lowered manually from the inside. Child height. Child choice. Then he saw the trail. Not blood. Thank God. Faint silver dust across the floor, almost invisible under the medical lights. Glitter from the decorative seal on Naevi's formal collar, the one that had started shedding at the edges back on Meriden. Tiny prints in it. Bare feet. One step, then another, toward the service door in the corner. She walked. Ethan said. The room snapped toward him. The second guard frowned. That's impossible. The side service hatch requires staff clearance. Ethan pointed without standing. Then your staff clearance is compromised. Queen Alice was beside him an instant later, dark formal layers whispering across the polished floor. Her eyes found the dust trail, then the half-open maintenance door now visible by the wall. For one terrible heartbeat, Ethan thought grief might finally break her control. Instead, it sharpened it. Seal the east wing, she said. No one exits. No one enters. Internal channels only. The guard hesitated. Your Majesty, if this is another extraction attempt. It is, the Queen said. And this time it is happening in my house. That got movement. Alarms changed pitch. Doors began locking down and rolling sequences through the corridor beyond. Palace staff, scattered with the disciplined terror of people who understood history, would punish them personally if they failed in the next 5 minutes. Ethan stood. His body still felt like Meriden had not finished with it. Smoke in his lungs. Strain in his back. Hands that wanted to shake now that there was a second child loss event in less than a day. He shoved all of it down. Where does that hatch lead? One of the med techs swallowed hard. Pediatric imaging and supply transit. Child size route. Yes. Queen Alice looked at him. Can you track her? The question should have belonged to guards, hounds, surveillance, a whole palace machine too expensive to fail. But Naevi had asked for him, had left a bed to look for the one person she believed would not disappear. In that instant, Ethan understood something ugly and simple. If this was a lure, it had been built around him. Yeah, he said, but I want one person only. No squad. No shouting. If she's frightened, numbers will drive her farther. The head of security, arriving too late and too armed, visibly disliked every word of that. Queen Alice didn't even glance at him. Granted, the security chief stepped forward. Your Majesty, with respect, the human is the center of both incidents. His presence is either a trigger or a tactical variable. Ethan turned on him before the Queen had to. She left a guarded royal suite while recovering from respiratory failure because she wanted to find me. That makes me a variable you use, not one you handcuff. The chief opened his mouth. The Queen cut him off without looking. If you continue speaking before thinking, I will replace you before dawn. Silence. Ethan didn't wait for more. He crossed the room to the service hatch and pulled it fully open. Beyond lay a narrow utility corridor lit in soft blue strips, lined with supply rails and child imaging carts. The air was cooler there, carrying the faint sterile sweetness of pediatric meds and the low hum of Activent systems. The silver dust continued across the floor in broken little marks, and Ethan felt his chest hurt with the force of what it meant. Naevi had done this barefoot. Sick, frightened, determined enough to leave safety because adults had once again turned the room around her into strategy. He crouched at the threshold. Naevi, he called not loud. It's Ethan. No answer. He looked back once. Queen Alice stood behind him with both hands at her sides, fingers curled so tightly her knuckles had gone pale under the skin. For the first time since Meriden, she looked less like a queen than a mother 1 minute from breaking something sacred if it meant getting her child back. She may think I left, Ethan said quietly. The Queen's voice came out just as quiet. Then tell her otherwise. He nodded and entered the service corridor alone. The hatch sealed behind him with a soft hiss, muting the alarms to a distant throb. The corridor bent left, then split into 2 branches. One toward imaging, one toward ventilation access and old nursery observatories built into the original palace design. Ethan studied the floor. Silver dust to the left. Then none. Then, maddeningly, a few specks to the right too. He exhaled once through his nose. Think. Naevi was weak. Breathing bad. Looking for him, not escaping randomly. A child under stress usually moved toward memory before logic. Bright places. Hiding places. Somewhere small enough to feel controllable. Then he saw it. One tiny handprint on the lower right wall, just above the vent rail, made in a mix of silver glitter and Deccan residue. Low route. He took the right branch. The corridor narrowed fast, curving into an older section of palace architecture where the walls lost their clean clinical finish and turned into brushed stone inset with observation glass. Through one pane, he glimpsed a dark chamber below, filled with old star maps and suspended mobiles shaped like Dominion worlds. A nursery observatory. Of course. The door ahead stood open by less than an inch. Ethan slowed his steps until even his boots stopped sounding like boots. He approached the gap and could hear it before he saw her. Thin, uneven breathing and the tiny stubborn sniff of a child trying not to cry because crying made adults rush and all wrong. He pushed the door gently. The observatory beyond glowed in twilight blue. Stars projected across the domed ceiling in slow, drifting patterns. Cushioned benches curved around the room. Old royal teaching models hung above like planets in miniature. And in the far corner, tucked behind a low display console with her blanket around her shoulders and her bare feet drawn under her, sat Naevi. She looked up at him like she had been holding herself together on borrowed strength, and had finally reached the person she had been saving it for. "You weren't there," she whispered. "God." Ethan crouched immediately, keeping distance first, making sure she could see both his hands. "I know. I'm here now." Her mouth trembled. "I woke up, and there were too many new people." He nodded. "Yeah. And they talked over me." "Yeah. I thought if I stayed in the bed, they would put me somewhere else." That one hit straight through him. He moved one step closer. "Naevi, look at me." She did. "I'm not leaving this palace without telling you first." He kept his voice steady, simple, built for a frightened child, and the echo of every promise adults had already broken around her. "You should not have had to come looking for me to know that." The tears came then. Quiet, furious little tears she clearly hated. Ethan closed the space between them and opened his arms just enough to offer, not take. She launched into him like a decision. He caught her carefully, one hand to the back of her head, the other around her shaking shoulders, and felt her finally let herself cry against his chest while the star maps drifted silently over them. Then, from the observatory doorway behind him, came the Queen's voice. Not loud, not angry, just shattered enough to make the room colder. "She only runs," Alice said, "when she already knows she was right to be afraid." The observatory stayed silent, except for Naevi's crying and the soft mechanical drift of false stars across the ceiling. Ethan didn't move at first. The child was locked against his chest with both arms around his neck, shaking hard in little waves she was trying to swallow back. Her fever heat pressed through his borrowed coat. One of her bare feet had gone cold against his wrist. Behind him, at the doorway, Queen Alice stood very still, and the stillness was somehow worse than if she had rushed forward. "She only runs," the Queen said again, quieter now, more to herself than to him, "when she already knows she was right to be afraid." The words settled into Ethan's spine. He looked down at Naevi and felt the whole ugly shape of it. Recovery bed. Strange medics. Armed guards outside a child's line of sight. Adults deciding things over her head in urgent voices while she still smelled Meriden smoke in her own hair. Of course she ran. She had survived because she listened when rooms turned dangerous before anyone admitted they had. Ethan lifted his eyes to the Queen. "Then the problem isn't that she left the bed." Alice met his gaze across the observatory's blue half-light. "No." For 1 second, they just looked at each other, not as ruler and outsider, not even as mother and medic, but as the two adults in the palace most immediately responsible for a frightened little girl who had already been forced to get good at reading fear. Ethan saw the grief in her then, not polished or distant anymore. Grief for Seleth, for Meriden, for the fact that her daughter's instincts had become sharper than the people assigned to protect her. Naevi's breathing hitched once more and then began, slowly, to calm. Ethan kept his voice low. "Hey kid." She didn't let go. "That's fair," he said softly. "You can keep holding on for another second. But I need to know something." He shifted just enough to ease the strain on his back and felt her tighten reflexively. "Did anyone touch you? Did anyone try to move you?" Her answer came muffled against his shoulder. "No." "Did anyone tell you to come here?" A pause. Then she shook her head. The Queen entered the room at last, each step measured, as if too much speed might count as another mistake. The star projections slid over her dark formal clothing and silver brow lines, making her look for one strange instant like part of the observatory itself. Old grief. Older authority. Ethan had seen commanders wear control like armor before. Alice wore it like she knew exactly how little it protected children. "Naevi," she said gently. The child went very still at the sound of her mother's voice, but did not lift her head. The Queen stopped 2 paces away. Smart. Close enough to reach. Far enough not to trap. Ethan noticed and respected it immediately. "I should have come to you sooner," Alice said. Naevi's fingers tightened in Ethan's collar. "I should have cleared the room before you woke." The Queen exhaled once, steadying herself in front of her own child. "And I should never have let you think you were about to be moved without being told why." There it was. No court language. No polished royal distance. Just an apology, clean and unprotected. Naevi finally turned her face enough to look at her mother. Her eyes were swollen and bright. They were making plans. Yes. About me. The Queen's mouth tightened. Yes. Ethan felt the little girl processing that. Not because she doubted it. Because hearing adults admit it out loud changed the shape of the room. Children could live through a lot if someone stopped lying to them decoratively. Naevi sniffed hard and asked the question Ethan knew was coming. Will they take Ethan away? The observatory got colder. Alice looked at him once before answering. That brief glance carried 1,000 moving parts: security, politics, appearances, risk. But when she looked back at her daughter, the answer came without visible hesitation. Not from you without explanation, she said. And not while I still have a voice in this palace. Naevi studied her mother's face with the brutal concentration children brought to promises. Then her gaze shifted to Ethan. He knew what she was asking. He nodded once. I'm not disappearing on you. That got him another fierce, desperate squeeze around the neck before she finally loosened enough for him to help her sit back on the cushioned floor bench. The blanket slipped from one shoulder. Ethan pulled it up carefully, checking her breathing without making it look like he was checking. Still rough. Better than before. Exhaustion was starting to drag at her again. The Queen knelt in front of her daughter. It was the first time Ethan had seen Alice lower herself into anything that looked like vulnerability, and the sight of it hit harder than all the war chamber command in the world. She tucked a loose strand of silver dark hair behind Naevi's ear with fingers that were controlled only by effort. Little star, she said, look at me. Naevi did. Someone inside the Dominion helped create this danger. The Queen did not soften the truth. I do not yet know who. That means until I do, there will be more guards, more checks, more noise than you deserve. Her voice dipped lower. But it also means you were right to trust your instincts when a room felt wrong. A tiny crease formed between Naevi's brows. Even if everyone said stay. Especially then, Alice said. Ethan looked away for a second because suddenly the room felt too intimate, like he was standing inside something private and sacred and earned at great cost. But Naevi reached for his sleeve again, and that pulled him back. Ethan, yeah. She glanced between him and her mother. Can both be true? What? That I'm safe now. Her voice thinned with tiredness. And also not really. God. The Queen closed her eyes briefly, and Ethan felt the question land in both of them. It was too intelligent, too exact, too unfairly earned for someone her age. But this was the reality now. A little girl with a crown in her blood, old enough in one day to know that rescue and danger could share a wall. Ethan crouched to bring himself level with her. Yeah, he said quietly. Both can be true. She watched him. You're safe in this room, he went on. With your mother. With me. That's true. You let the next part stay plain. And there's still bad people outside this room making bad choices. That's also true. Naevi absorbed that without flinching. Then very softly, so what do we do? The Queen answered first. We get smarter than they are. A breath later, Ethan added, and we stop making your safety depend on everybody else getting honest all at once. That drew the smallest flash of surprise from Alice, followed by something close to agreement. Before anyone could say more, a discreet chime sounded at the observatory door. Not alarm this time. Palace clearance. The door slid open enough for Commander Rivik to appear in the gap. He took one look at the three of them. The princess wrapped in a blanket between her mother and the human medic, and whatever speech he had prepared visibly changed direction. Your Majesty, he said, we have something. The Queen rose immediately, but not before resting her hand once against Naevi's hair. Speak. Rivik's expression had gone tight in a new way. Not the military tension of containment failure. The colder one. Internal threat becoming specific. Advisor Sarat attempted to access sealed fleet channels 12 minutes after your lockdown order, he said. When palace security moved to detain him, he fled toward the lower transit ring. The observatory seemed to narrow around the sentence. Naevi looked up at her mother. Cold flowers? Rivik went still. The Queen's face changed with terrible precision. Yes, she said. Ethan felt every nerve in his body wake back up. Because suddenly the enemy had a name, or close enough to one. Not theory, not chamber suspicion. A real person moving through a real palace toward real exits while fleets still waited for orders that could burn worlds. Alice turned to Ethan. Stay with her. The command came fast, instinctive. Ethan was already nodding. The Queen looked down at Naevi one last time. No one but him, and my direct voice enters this room. Do you understand? Naevi nodded. Then Alice was gone, black and silver cutting through the observatory doorway like vengeance, given legal authority. Commander Revik vanished with her. The door sealed. Silence came down hard after it. Naevi looked at Ethan in the drifting blue starlight, small hands nodding in the blanket, eyes too old again. Did I stop a war? She whispered. Ethan sat beside her on the low bench and looked up at the fake stars because the truth of it was too large for the room. For tonight, he said. The palace went quiet in the way dangerous places did when too many important people started running at once. Ethan felt it even from inside the sealed observatory. Not silence exactly. The hum of the ventilation still threaded through the walls. The fall stars still moved across the domed ceiling in slow silver drifts. Somewhere deeper in the medical wing, alarms had lowered from panic to controlled lock status. But beneath all of that, the palace had changed tempo. Orders were being whispered instead of announced. Doors were sealing. Internal routes were narrowing. People were choosing sides in their heads before anyone asked them to do it out loud. Naevi sat beside him on the curved bench with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders and both bare feet tucked under one leg. She looked very small inside all that projected starlight. Too small for the sentence she had just spoken. Did I stop a war? Ethan leaned back against the bench and let the question sit between them for a second. He had learned a long time ago that children noticed when adults rushed to clean up a truth because it felt too big for them. For tonight, he said. Naevi watched him carefully. That is not the same as forever. No, Ethan said. It isn't. She nodded, like she appreciated the honesty even if she didn't like it. Then she looked toward the sealed observatory door. Mother sounded like the sharp, kind of angry. That's accurate. A tiny flicker touched the corner of her mouth. You also get that look. Ethan rubbed one hand over his face. Yeah, well, I'm trying to cut back. That seems unlikely. That got a laugh out of him before he could stop it. Quiet. Tired. Real enough that it eased something in the room. Naevi's shoulders dropped a fraction. He saw it happen and hated how much experience he'd gained in reading tiny fear shifts in one child over one terrible day. He looked down at her. How's your breathing? She tested it like she'd been asked about weather. One inhale. A careful exhale. Bad, but less dramatic. I'm adding that to your chart. You do not have a chart. I can improvise one. Naevi considered that. That sounds human. Usually when people say that, it's an insult. I have not decided yet. Another beat. Another flicker of almost smile. It should have felt lighter than it did. But Ethan could still feel the charge in the palace walls. Somewhere beyond the sealed door, Queen Alice was chasing the man whose sin a child had remembered while half-sedated and feverish. Somewhere beyond that, fleets still waited on orders that had almost been written in grief and manipulation. Naevi must have seen the tension come back into his face. You want to go help? She said softly. He looked at her. Not accusation. Just observation. Yeah, he admitted. But you won't. Also yeah. Because of me. He exhaled slowly through his nose. Because your mother asked me to stay with you. That is not the same answer. He turned his head and really looked at her then. The child was exhausted, sick, and wrapped in a blanket too large for her, but there was nothing vague in her gaze. Royal blood or not, she had the unnerving accuracy of someone who had been forced to notice too much too fast. No, he said quietly. It isn't. Naevi waited. Ethan clasped his hands loosely between his knees. I want to help because someone dangerous is still moving. But I'm staying because you ran from a room full of adults and came looking for me. He held her eyes. That means leaving you now would teach the wrong lesson. Something in her face shifted at that. Not relief exactly. More like the place where fear had been bracing for abandonment didn't get the result it expected. She looked down at the blanket. Seleth said there are kinds of leaving. Ethan felt the old grief rise again. Sounds like Seleth was smart. She was strict. Those things overlap a lot. Naevi gave a tiny hum that might have been agreement. A chime sounded at the observatory door. Both of them went still. Ethan was on his feet before the second tone, one hand up to keep Naevi behind him. The room felt suddenly much smaller. He looked at the access panel. Direct voice print only, the Queen had said. No one but him and my direct voice enters this room. A pause. Then Queen Alice's voice came through the speaker, low and clear. Naevi. Ethan. Open. Ethan crossed to the panel and keyed the release. The door slid apart. The Queen entered alone. That, more than anything, made his stomach drop. No commander. No guards. No aides carrying slates. Just Alice in dark formal clothing, one sleeve torn at the cuff, a faint scorch mark across the silver edge of her collar, and a face gone so still it had circled past anger into something colder. Naevi stood on the bench without thinking. Mother. Alice crossed the room in 3 steps and folded her daughter into both arms with a force that told Ethan exactly how close the night had come to becoming something worse. Naevi clung to her immediately, blanket and all. The Queen held her for a long breath, then another, eyes closed, before she seemed to remember Ethan was still in the room. He's dead, she said. No title. No context. She didn't need either. Sarat. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. How? The Queen kept one hand at the back of Naevi's head. He ran for a sealed transit spur beneath the Eastern Archive ring. Took one of the outer code relays hostage. Tried to force a fleet release through an old war emergency channel. Her mouth hardened. When Revik's team cornered him, he triggered his own burn capsule rather than be taken. Naevi went very still in her mother's arms. Ethan saw the child hearing more than anyone wanted her to. The Queen noticed too. She adjusted, just slightly, shifting from telling a witness to speaking near daughter. It's over, she said softly to Naevi. But Ethan knew it wasn't. Not really. People like Sarat didn't do all that alone. Not usually. Too much confidence. Too much planning. Too much assumption that a dead nursemaid and a missing heir would create exactly the kind of political pressure he wanted. One ambitious advisor could start a fire. The shape of this smelled bigger than one match. Alice looked at Ethan, and he knew she was thinking the same thing. He deleted most of his channel trail before the intercept, she said. But Tauren recovered enough to confirm unauthorized contact with 2 noble houses and 1 fleet procurement office. There it is, Ethan muttered. The Queen's eyes sharpened. You expected more than one. I expected fear with funding. That drew the smallest, bleakest change in her expression. Agreement, probably. Or irritation that he was right in her palace again. Naevi pulled back just enough to look up at her mother. Did he want me dead? The question tore through the room. Alice knelt so fast, Ethan barely saw her move. She put both hands on her daughter's shoulders. I don't know, she said, and Ethan respected her more for not lying. But he wanted you gone from where truth could speak for itself. That much is real. Naevi absorbed that in silence. Then she looked over at Ethan. Because I saw him bow. That was the detail. One tiny thing. A child's memory of manners at the wrong moment. Enough to crack open a plot that nearly sent fleets into the dark. Ethan stepped closer, but not too close. Because you remembered, he said. And because you said it out loud. The little girl's mouth trembled, though whether from fear or the weight of what she'd done, he couldn't tell. The Queen rose again, more slowly this time. The chamber reconvenes in 1 hour, she said. This time not for war posture. For arrests. Her gaze stayed on Ethan. I want you there. He blinked. What? Naevi answered before her mother could. Because they believe you. The room went quiet after that. Ethan looked at the child, then at the Queen, and understood the shape of what came next. Not rescue anymore. Not survival. Witness. He had carried the heir across Meriden, but now he was being asked to carry something else through the capital. Truth ugly enough to survive power. Alice moved to the observatory door, then stopped and looked back. You asked in the Deccan suite why everyone made this harder than it had to be. Ethan remembered. The Queen's voice went low and exact. By dawn, we may learn how many people in my government preferred a dead child to an inconvenient future. Then she left the door open behind her. And for the first time all night, Ethan felt something worse than exhaustion. He felt what came next gathering. The chamber was louder after midnight than it had been at dusk. Ethan felt it before he crossed the threshold. Not volume exactly. Pressure. The kind built from too many sleepless officials packed into one room with fresh fear, bad optics, and nowhere left to send the blame. The Valerian war chamber had changed shape since he last stood in it. The tactical fleet projections were gone. In their place hung branching data trees, channel maps, seal authorizations, and financial links pulled from Saret's burn network before the man turned himself into ash. This was no longer a war council. It was an autopsy. Queen Alice stood at the primary dais in black formal dress with no outer insignia beyond the Dominion crest at her throat. No ornamental court layers. No softness. She had stripped herself down to command and grief and left the rest somewhere private. Around her, nobles and ministers filled the curved tiers in tight, controlled silence. A few seats were empty now, not by accident. Arrests had already begun. Ethan took his place at the lower witness ring in a clean uniform someone had forced on him 20 minutes earlier. It still felt wrong on his body. Too polished. Too easy to mistake for belonging. He hadn't slept. His lungs still hurt. His hands still carried faint traces of Meriden under the nails, no matter how hard palace sanitation tried to erase them. Above all that sat the simplest fact of the night. Naevi was not in the room. And he hated that more than he expected. She was in a secured adjoining suite with two vetted medics. One palace tutor she trusted, and Commander Rivik personally rotating the door detail, because Queen Alice no longer trusted inherited loyalties farther than she could throw them. Rationally, Ethan knew that was as safe as the child could be. Emotionally, he had become too used to hearing her breathe. Counselor houses were called by name as the session opened. 3 minor nobles, 1 procurement liaison, 2 fleet coordinators, all tied by channels, private fund movements, or sealed voice traffic to Saret's unauthorized relay net. None of them had expected the child to live long enough to become evidence. Tauren, the forensic minister, stood in the center floor with a display slate lit in pale blue. For a man Ethan had initially read as dry and decorative, he was performing beautifully under pressure. No drama, just sequence, transfers, timestamps, cross-domain handshakes. The kind of precise truth that made liars sweat because they couldn't accuse it of passion. Advisor Saret's communications pattern escalated 2 days before the Meriden state visit, Tauren said. His private channels show urgency around succession timing, quarantine conditions, and fleet reaction probabilities. He flicked one hand. A financial thread lit red over the chamber. Funds moved through ceremonial restoration accounts into emergency logistics shells. Standard laundering through patriotic language. A low ripple moved through the upper tiers. Ethan almost admired the audacity. Dress treason like tradition, and half the room would stand too close to it before smelling the rot. Queen Alice did not move. Purpose. Tauren turned another page of projected evidence. Preliminary conclusion. Engineer a royal casualty amid quarantine collapse. Assign blame externally or ambiguously. Compel immediate retaliatory posture. Centralize military discretion under emergency authority. One of the accused nobles half rose to his feet. That is interpretation, not proof. Tauren looked at him with visible professional contempt. No, the proof begins on the next panel. Ethan would have liked him more under less catastrophic circumstances. The next panel brought up Deccan Gate command transcripts. Ethan's voice filled the chamber, rough and exhausted from the recording. She needs treatment, not theater. Then the response channel. You will surrender the child. The room tightened around the playback. One fleet coordinator went pale. Another stared fixedly ahead, as if stillness could reduce involvement retroactively. Ethan stood in the witness ring and had the deeply surreal experience of listening to his own near fury become state evidence. Tauren let the audio end in silence. Had the medic complied, he said, the child would have entered recovery under channels already influenced by Saret's false abduction framing. Had he failed to reach Deccan at all, casualty attribution would likely have favored an external enemy narrative. That line landed exactly where it should. Not just guilt now. Need. The conspiracy had needed Ethan blamed. Needed him non-royal, foreign, stubborn enough to disobey. Visible enough to carry public outrage. The perfect villain was always the one who looked like procedural inconvenience. Queen Alice's gaze shifted to him. Medic Harlo. He straightened, though every part of him was tired of being looked at. When you refused seizure orders at Southern Deccan, did you understand you were defying Dominion command in front of an armed retrieval unit? Yes. Why did you refuse? The chamber leaned. He could have made it noble. Something about principles, duty, humanity. Instead, he gave the truth, because truth was what had gotten them this far. Because she was dying tired, he said, and everybody talking around me sounded more interested in ownership than oxygen. Silence hit hard. One of the lesser nobles muttered something under his breath, and got silenced by a look from the queen. Ethan kept his eyes forward. He was done being intimidated by rooms that almost killed children cleanly. Alice asked the next question without changing expression. If you had known then that the plot reached inside my own government, would you have acted differently? He thought about Meriden, the dead nursemaid, Naevi hidden in the wall, the half-open gate, the rifles, the little girl asking who would carry her if they shot him. No, he said. That got attention. Explain, said the queen. Ethan exhaled once. Bad people at the top doesn't change what the child at the bottom needs. The sentence left the room quieter than before. Some looked angry, some uncomfortable. A few Ethan noticed looked ashamed. Good. Shame had uses if it arrived before the next disaster. Then the side chamber door opened. Every guard in the room stiffened before they realized who it was. Naevi stepped in wearing a simple soft gray recovery wrap and no royal ornaments at all. One hand held the older palace tutor's fingers for balance. The other clutched the corner of a small thermal shawl around her shoulders. She looked pale, smaller than the chamber deserved, but steady enough to walk. Queen Alice's composure broke by a hair. You were told to rest. Naevi looked up at her mother, then at the room. They are using my name without me. No one in the chamber seemed prepared for that. Ethan felt something painful and proud move through him. The tutor bowed. Your Majesty, she insisted. Of course she did. Alice looked at her daughter for one long second, measuring health against will and seeing too much of herself in the result. Bring her forward. Naevi crossed the chamber slowly. Ethan moved without thinking, meeting her halfway, so she wouldn't have to walk the whole distance alone. When she reached him, she took his hand with complete confidence and kept going. That one gesture did more damage to every lie in the room than Tarn's evidence had. The child stopped beside the witness ring and looked out at the gathered nobility. Her voice was quiet, so quiet the chamber had to become respectful enough to hear it. Seleth said not to trust pretty words when people are scared, she said. She said, look at what they rushed toward. No one moved. Naevi's eyes shifted across the room and found the accused seats one by one. They rushed toward ships. A tremor ran through the upper tiers. The queen descended from the dais at last and stood beside her daughter. Not behind, beside. That mattered too. My heir has spoken, Alice said. My evidence minister has spoken. My witness has spoken. By dawn, every channel tied to Sarah will be seized, every associated house placed under inquiry, and every fleet order issued in the last 6 hours reviewed under my seal. Her gaze swept the chamber like judgment made visible. No war will be launched to protect the guilty from the truth. Ethan looked down at Naevi's small hand in his and understood the strange, terrifying shape of the thing they had built over one impossible day. Not trust exactly, more like a line held under pressure, long enough for truth to cross alive. The queen lifted her daughter into her arms then, and Naevi, finally looking her age again, rested her head against Alice's shoulder. For one breath, the whole war chamber looked smaller than the child who had just stopped it. Dawn found Ethan in the East Palace infirmary with dried Meriden, ash still trapped in the seams of his boots, and a child asleep against his side who had just stopped a war. He had meant to sit there for a minute. That had been an hour ago. The recovery suite was quieter now. Not silent, but human quiet, the kind built for machines doing their jobs, and exhausted people finally running out of fresh fear. The lights had been dimmed from surgical white to a low amber wash. Through the tall glass wall beyond the med-wing corridor, the first pale glow of the Dominion capital crept over distant towers and suspended bridges. Somewhere far below, air traffic had resumed in cautious streams. The world was moving again, carefully, like it didn't trust the night to be over yet. Naevi slept curled against him on the cushioned observation bench, wrapped in a soft thermal blanket that had slid halfway down one shoulder. Her breathing was still rough at the edges, but it no longer sounded like each inhale had to be negotiated. One small hand remained fisted in the front of Ethan's uniform shirt, even in sleep. He had tried once, very gently, to shift away. She had tightened her grip without waking. So he stayed. Across the room, the palace tutor dozed upright in a chair with a data slate open on her lap, and one eye not quite fully closed. Commander Rivik stood at the outer door, pretending to review security rotations, and very clearly deciding Ethan was no longer worth arguing with if the princess had physically attached herself to him. A medic moved quietly between monitors, adjusting flow rates and scanning the overnight charts with the reverence-tired professionals reserved for numbers that had finally stopped getting worse. Ethan sat still and felt all of it catch up. The dead nursemaid, the maintenance conduit, the half-open decking gate, the rifles, the queen, the chamber. The moment Naevi had said they rushed toward ships and turn a room full of power inside out with one child-sized truth. His body hurt everywhere now that the running part was over. His hands were cut. His shoulders felt torn from sockets. Smoke had settled in his chest like a second weight. He was so tired he could feel each blink separately. And under all of it sat a quieter thing. Not relief. Not exactly. The awful tenderness that came after carrying someone long enough to know the exact size of their fear. Naevi shifted against him and made a small, unhappy sound in her sleep. Ethan looked down immediately. Hey, easy. Her brow smoothed. The hand in his shirt loosened, then tightened again with less panic this time. From the doorway came a voice pitched low enough not to wake her. You were very bad at leaving. Queen Alice stood there alone. No guards. No aides. No ceremonial layers. Just a dark mourning robe over simple court underclothes. Her hair unbound for the first time Ethan had seen it, silver black falling loose over one shoulder. She looked more tired than he had imagined a queen was allowed to look in public. Less armored. More dangerous in a quieter way. Ethan glanced down at the child, still using him as a lifeline. I tried once. And he shifted one shoulder very slightly. I was overruled. That got the smallest possible change at the corner of her mouth. The queen crossed the room in silence and stopped near the bench. Her gaze moved first to Naevi, taking in the sleeping face, the improved color, the stubborn grip. Something deep in her expression loosened. Not enough for peace. Enough for gratitude to get through. She has not slept unless she knew where you were, Alice said. Ethan didn't know what to do with that, so he told the truth. I'm not sure that's healthy. No, the queen said softly, but it is understandable. They stood in the quiet together for a moment, listening to the hum of the infirmary and the city slowly waking outside the glass. Then Alice said, Saret's network is broken. Ethan looked up. By sunrise, 16 detentions will be public. 2 houses are under seal. Fleet Command has withdrawn emergency posture and issued internal review orders under my authority. Her eyes lifted to the brightening skyline beyond the infirmary wall. There will be no war launched over Meriden. The words should have felt triumphant. Instead, they landed heavy. Too many dead for triumph. Seleth among them. Ethan thought of the nursemaid's hand locked around the torn royal sash, of the little maintenance conduit, of a woman who had enough time to choose the shape of a child's survival and not enough time to live through her own. Good, he said, and heard the exhaustion in it. The queen noticed. Of course she did. You think that should have cost less. Ethan's laugh was too tired to be called one. Shouldn't it have? Alice looked at him for a long second. Yes. The simplicity of that almost hurt more than any royal speech could have. She came a little closer then, lowering her voice further as Naevi stirred but did not wake. I've spent the last 6 hours receiving apologies from people who nearly burned worlds because they were faster at anger than evidence. Her gaze rested briefly on her daughter's sleeping hand curled in Ethan's shirt. Only 2 of those apologies have mattered to me. Ethan frowned slightly. 2. One was for my daughter. Something flickered in the Queen's face. Pain, pride, both. She apologized for leaving the recovery room. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. And the second? Alice met his eyes. This one. The room seemed to hold still around that. You came to Meriden as contracted rescue personnel, she said. You owed my house nothing. Instead, you carried my child through quarantine collapse while my own command structure prepared to treat you as a convenient enemy. Her voice stayed controlled, but only by effort. Ethan Harlo, I am sorry. He had not been ready for that. Not from her. Not cleanly. Not with no witnesses to perform for. He looked down at Naevi because the Queen's face was suddenly too much to read all at once. The little girl had one cheek pressed aside now, breathing easier, alive because a dead woman chose well, and a chain of bad systems failed too slowly to stop him. You don't need to apologize for what he did, Ethan said at last. Alice answered immediately. I do if the structure that sheltered him was mine. That was a ruler's answer. A mother's too. Before Ethan could find anything worth saying back, Naevi stirred harder and blinked awake in slow confusion. For one disoriented second, she clutched at Ethan's shirt with both hands, then saw her mother standing beside them and relaxed. Did I miss breakfast? She mumbled. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. The Queen actually laughed. Not much. Enough to make the room feel more survivable. Yes, Alice said. Unforgivably. Naevi thought about that with the seriousness only a child could give a small injustice after surviving a large one. Then I want to. That seems ambitious, Ethan murmured. She tipped her head back enough to look up at him. You also need breakfast. I appreciate the diagnosis. It is accurate. The palace tutor made a sleepy sound from her chair that might have been a laugh. Even Rivik at the door looked briefly less carved from military regret. Naevi shifted upright, blanket falling into her lap, and looked between Ethan and her mother with sleepy, dangerous clarity. You are both staying, yes? The Queen and Ethan answered at the same time. Yes. Naevi nodded, satisfied, as if that settled the structural integrity of the entire dominion. A medic approached quietly, then, with the morning scan slate and a tray request, hesitating only when she saw the princess awake and attached to the human again. Your Highness, she said gently, we should move you back to the bed. Naevi considered the proposal. Can the bed come here? The medic looked momentarily defeated by royalty in its purest form. Ethan smiled despite himself. That's not usually how beds work. They should improve, Naevi said. Alice put a hand lightly at her daughter's back. We will negotiate with the furniture after food. That seemed acceptable. As the city brightened beyond the infirmary glass and the long night finally began to loosen its grip, Ethan helped guide the little girl upright. She swayed once, then steadied between him and her mother, one small hand in each of theirs. No fanfare, no chamber, no fleets. Just a child walking toward morning between the 2 people who had refused to let the night decide her story. And Ethan understood then what would stay with him long after Meriden, long after the hearings and the sealed channels and the dead conspirators were folded into history. Not the accusation, not even the rescue. The moment a frightened little girl looked at rooms full of power, chose kindness anyway, and made the whole dominion stop running toward war long enough to remember what it was supposed to protect.